Before we begin our second walk at Angelus-Rosedale, I must correct a couple mistakes I made in Part 1. In the segment about actor Louis Stone, I said this: best remembered for the role of Judge James Hardy in the popular Andy Hardy series produced at MGM and starring Andy Rooney. Of course, what I meant to say was the star of the Andy Hardy movies was Mickey Rooney. It even says Mickey in the script that I wrote. So to Mickey, wherever you are, I give you my sincerest apologies. And to the actual Andy Rooney, who once said, if you have a 50-50 chance of getting something right, there's a 90% probability you'll get it wrong, I apologize to you too, sir. My second slip-up was on the birthplace of silent film comedian Eric Campbell. When the Scottish Film Council placed this cenotaph in the cemetery in the mid-90s, it was still believed that he was born in Dunoon, Scotland. The claim seemed to originate when Campbell began working with Chaplin in America. However, in 2011, a relative came forward with proof that the larger-than-life comedian was of English birth. It's unclear why he would have said he was a Scot, but in Hollywood, a town whose industry is make-believe, it's pretty much business as usual. I want to thank my viewers who so kindly pointed out my errors, and I give special thanks to Ken Griffiths for the fascinating information he sent on Eric Campbell. Now that that's all cleared up, let's begin Part 2. Angelus-Rosedale was established in 1884 and was the first cemetery in Los Angeles to welcome persons of all races and religions. And in 1887, the founders added to the site the first crematory west of the Rockies. At the time, it was only the second such facility in the United States to offer cremation. With its shaded walks and expansive lawn-covered landscaping, the cemetery became a popular tourist destination, one that was worth writing home about, as can be seen in these postcards dating from the early 1900s. For nearly a century and a half, families have chosen Rosedale as the preferred resting place for their loved ones, where now many generations are interred side by side. Over the next hour, we will meet a diverse group of people, from pioneers to soldiers, politicians to business moguls, and even an all-star cast of movie stars. There are even a few surprises in the mix. But as different as they might all be, they share a common attribute that in their own way they changed the world in which they lived. Behind every plot there is a story, and every story is a chapter in the history of us all. So come walk with me and take a step back into our shared past here at Angelus-Rosedale Cemetery. When 22-year-old Horace Bell arrived in Los Angeles in 1852, he found a town where, to use his own words, there were more desperados than any place on the Pacific coast. To put an end to the lawlessness, he joined a volunteer police force called the Los Angeles Rangers. With their shoot first and ask questions later style of justice, they cleared the hills and valleys of bandits and murderers. Always game for adventure and new opportunities, he joined with mercenary William Walker in his failed attempt to overthrow the government of Nicaragua in 1856. A year later, he fought with Benito Juarez during Mexico's War of Reform. When the American Civil War broke out, Bell returned to his native Indiana and joined the Union Army as a scout, where he rose to the rank of major. At war's end, He returned to L.A. and at the urging of his wife became a lawyer. He was an outspoken critic of the corruption that ran through the city's government. In response, the reform-minded Bell published a weekly journal called The Porcupine. With the motto, "Fearless, Faithful, and Free," he used the periodical to expose crooked politicians, judges, and police officials. During his tenure as publisher of The Porcupine, he caused the removal of 4 chiefs of police. One of them, Chief Henry King, stormed into Bell's office and fired a shot at him before being overpowered by Bell and his son. In 1881, he published Reminiscences of a Ranger, a memoir of his early days in Los Angeles. The book is considered a classic and is still in print today. After a long, eventful life, Major Horace Bell died on June 29, 1918. He was laid to rest at Rosedale, beside friend and foe alike. Mayor John Gregg Nichols was a contemporary and a friend of Horace Bell. As a fellow member of the L.A. Rangers, the gun-toting exploits of the city's chief executive is mentioned in Bell's Reminiscences. In April 1851, Nichols' son John Jr. was the first child born in the city as an American citizen. From 1852 to 1853, Nichols served as LA's mayor. He was the first to be elected after California's admission into the Union. His second term as mayor lasted from 1856 to 1859. Both in and out of elected office, he led the city out of its violent beginnings and onto a course of expansion and growth. Visible from his humble resting place are the spires of the modern metropolis that he helped build. Mayor Nichols died in 1898 at age 85. Interestingly, neither his or his wife Florida have their names inscribed on their monument. However, the names of 2 of their sons, Louis and Thomas, are inscribed. There are several more of LA's early mayors buried at Rosedale. One worth noting is Arthur C. Harper, who was also a fellow grave explorer. Shortly after he took office, the LA Times reported on his visit to the old city cemetery, where he reminisced about the people he knew and even inspected the looted tomb of Robert Carlyle, who died in an infamous 1865 shootout. Harper probably would have been better off had he stuck to touring graveyards, because as a politician he was most fabulously corrupt. Almost from the moment he took office, he gave patronage jobs in return for favors. It was also alleged that he took bribes from owners of brothels and gambling parlors. Although he vehemently denied the allegations, Harper resigned from office in March 1909 as recall efforts were underway. Harper wasn't all bad. He initiated designs for the new Civic Center and oversaw the construction of the first motion picture studios. After leaving office, Harper served as vice president and general manager of the Consolidated Pipe Company in Bakersfield, California. He died on Christmas Day, 1948, while visiting his daughter for the holidays. In Reminiscences of a Ranger, author Horace Bell said one of the first persons he encountered when stepping ashore in Southern California at San Pedro was Phineas Banning. Banning was the owner of the stagecoach line that brought Bell and many others into the fledgling city. He famously sent his drivers off with the cry, "Now lads, mind your helm and let her drive." As LA's prosperity increased, so did Banning's. He owned a large section of land about 20 miles south of the city named Wilmington, after his place of birth in Delaware. His home still stands today and is operated as a museum. During the Civil War, he donated a portion of his land to the U.S. government. It would be called the Drum Barracks and served as the Union Army's southwestern headquarters until 1870. In return, he was given the honorary rank of Brigadier General, and for the remainder of his life, he insisted upon being referred to as General Banning. He campaigned to connect L.A. to the rest of the country by rail, and organized the Los Angeles and San Pedro Railroad, which was Southern California's first railroad. In a life filled with accomplishments, Banning's most lasting contribution was founding the Port of Los Angeles at San Pedro. It wouldn't gain federal approval until after his death, but it remains one of the busiest harbors in the world. Due to declining health, Banning was in semi-retirement when he died in San Francisco on March 8, 1885, at the young age of 54. He is remembered today as the father of San Pedro Harbor and as the man who opened Los Angeles to the world. Dr. David Burbank left New England in 1853 and settled in San Francisco. He was a dentist by trade, but his interests were in land. By 1870, he moved to Southern California and was the owner of the Providencia and San Rafael ranchos, where he raised sheep. In 1887, he sold his property to the Providencia Land, Water, and Development Company, of which he was a shareholder. He and his partners laid out the plans for a new city that would bear his name. Toward the end of his life, Dr. Burbank was building theaters and playhouses on the West Coast. Perhaps it is fitting that the current town of Burbank is a mecca for the entertainment industry. Dr. Burbank never sat still. In fact, the term workaholic might have been coined for him. He remained busy to the very end of his life, which came on January 21, 1895. He rests here with his wife Clara and his daughter Addie. Remmy Nadeau was a teamster by trade, and he came to Los Angeles from Quebec, Canada in the early 1860s. He owned and operated a fleet of 20 mule teams that delivered supplies from the city to the silver mines of Inyo County. Later, he invested in beet farms and vineyards. With his fortune secured, he opened the Hotel Nadeau at Spring and First Street in L.A. It was the first four-story structure built in the city. Among its modern conveniences was an electric elevator. Upon his death in 1887, the Los Angeles Times summed up his productive life with the following words: "He was a man of much strength and character, a Republican by conviction, but never a politician nor an office seeker. His qualities of mind and heart won the respect of all who knew him. He leaves a wife and 4 children." Remmy Nadeau's monument is one of the most distinctive at Rosedale. Here it can be seen in this postcard from the early 1900s. When it was completed in the year following his death, nothing like it had ever been seen in the city. In fact, its construction was considered a newsworthy event. The Herald newspaper described the monument in great detail. They said that the statue on top, made of Carrara marble, took an Italian artist 9 months to carve. The entire memorial, they said, cost $15,000, over $500,000 today. At the foot of the monument is a simple headstone that is easy to overlook. Inscribed with Remmy Nadeau's initials, it marks his actual resting place. Whether seeking our own private island or a secluded slice of beachfront property, it seems that humans have an almost spiritual calling to the sea. There can be no doubt that it is the reason people pay so handsomely for an ocean view, and the beaches of Southern California are famous the world over through music, story, and film. Long before the Beach Boys got around and Frankie and Annette partied on the sands of Malibu, the potential of the California coast as a personal and public playground was recognized by some of the 19th century's greatest capitalists, and a few of them are here at Rosedale. This neoclassical mausoleum holds the remains of Colonel Albert Beecher Hotchkiss. Born in Pennsylvania, he was an attorney for the Southern Pacific Railroad. As an early settler in the Los Angeles area, he was at the center of the Southern California land boom. His greatest investment by far was in the coastal community of Santa Monica, and it was there that he built a home on the cliffs that overlook the ocean. Colonel Hotchkiss was one of a few prominent citizens who successfully worked to achieve cityhood for Santa Monica in 1886. After his passing in 1905, the colonel was laid to rest here, which is about 12 miles from his home by the sea. The mausoleum that attracts the most attention at Rosedale is this red sandstone pyramid. It is one of two such mausoleums in the cemetery. It is the resting place of George Rufus Chateau and his wife Clara. George already owned a successful retail business in Michigan when he received his call to join the building boom in Los Angeles. In 1887, he put together a group of investors who purchased the island of Catalina with designs to turn it into a resort with a small town called Chateau City. His brother-in-law operated 2 hotels on the island, and it was his wife who convinced him to rename the town Avalon. George later sold his interest in Catalina to the Banning family as he turned toward mining. His life ended tragically in a train collision in 1893. His wife Clara Ruth would continue to add to his business empire, as well as organize many charitable institutions until her death in 1942. The most striking monument in Rosedale was built in the memory of businessman and real estate tycoon Frederick Hastings Rindge. Coming from an aristocratic New England family, Frederick moved west, where in 1892 he purchased the entire 13,000-acre Spanish land grant called Rancho Malibu. He intended it to be the location of his country home by the sea, but after the addition of an adjacent 17,000 acres, he ran a successful cattle ranch on the site. Over the years, the property would include its own railroad and dam. Frederick Rindge, who suffered ill health most of his life, died in 1905 at the young age of 48, leaving behind an estate valued at nearly $2 billion today. His widow May continued running the Malibu Ranch for the rest of her life. However, most of her time and fortune was spent fighting the state of California in court over the road they wanted to build across her property. Eventually, the road that became Pacific Coast Highway was built, and she was forced to sell portions of what was the last intact California Spanish land grant in existence. After May's death in 1941, the Rindge family continued to be great contributors to the Malibu area. The site of Pepperdine University was donated by the family. Today, the only memorial to Frederick and May Rindge is here in Rosedale. Its design is reminiscent of the ancient lighthouse of Alexandria, that for centuries safely guided ships to harbor. Whether the resemblance was intentional or not, it seems appropriate for the couple who built a personal empire by the sea. Located in Section 5 in the northeast corner of Rosedale is a group of ghostly white headstones that predate the ones around them. A memorial marker proclaims that they are the last fragments of LA's first non-denominational cemetery that sat atop Fort Moore Hill in the middle of downtown. Burials in what has been called the Fort Hill, Protestant, or City Cemetery began as early as 1847, but LA's rapid growth quickly put the graveyard at burial capacity. In 1886, it was closed permanently, and the slow process of relocating the bodies began. In 1913, the city purchased this space for the unclaimed bodies still buried on the hill. By then, the old city cemetery was in an advanced state of deterioration from repeated vandalism and neglect. The cemetery was also the setting for criminal activity. On July 21, 1901, the LA Times reported the curious story of an early morning duel at the Masonic burying ground. The story goes that at 5:30 a.m., a one-horse hack drove up to the gate and 3 men got out and disappeared into the shadows. A few moments later, 2 shots rang out, breaking the morning stillness. A newspaper boy out on his rounds witnessed only 2 of the men return to the hack that hastily disappeared down Hill Street, never to be seen again. Investigators combed the cemetery, but found no trace of the 3rd man. Was it a duel as the newspapers suggested? Or a simple prank? Or might it have been something more sinister, such as an execution? It's another story lost to time, and the only remaining witnesses are these headstones. Here in this undated photo taken at the city cemetery, we see the headstone of Charles Volney Howard, who was killed in a gunfight at the St. Elmo Hotel in 1869. Today, the very same headstone, along with its unfortunate owner, resides in Rosedale. By 1940, the clean-out on the hill was thought to be complete, but over the years, the bones of LA's unknown pioneers continue to be unearthed by construction digs at the old site. With every new discovery, some as recently as a few years ago, the remains are interred here at Rosedale. It makes one wonder if the unidentified bones belong to trapper Andrew Sublette, who was killed by a bear in Malibu Canyon and became the first recorded burial on the hill in December 1853. Legend has it that after Andy was buried, his faithful dog Buck refused to leave the grave. The grieving hound also refused to eat or drink, and soon after joined his old master in death. Perhaps the bones were from one of the 4 soldiers who are rumored to have been buried on the hill in 1847, after they were killed when a gunpowder magazine exploded at Fort Moore. Or they might belong to 30-year-old Mandy Ballard, who died in childbirth in 1871. Rosedale wasn't the only cemetery to receive transfers from the hill, but nowhere else in the city will you find as clear a picture of what once was as this graveyard within a graveyard. A walk through Rosedale reveals monuments and memorials not only for the dead, but for the living as well. This impressive stone was placed for the Los Angeles Typographical Union, post number 174. In 1967, the Union headed a strike against the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner that became one of the longest in modern history. Lasting 10 years, the strike was a contributing factor to the newspaper's demise in 1989. On Memorial Day 1908, a great celebration was held at Rosedale. This blurry image recalls the day. The Stanton Post of the Grand Army of the Republic, comprised of Union Civil War veterans, unveiled a massive cannon. Called a Rodman Gun after its inventor, it is a 10-inch smoothbore Columbiad that was used for coastal defense during the war between the states. In the 1870s, it was converted to an 8-inch rifle. Today, more than a century after its unveiling, the iron relic keeps constant vigil over the boys in blue. A short distance away, another monument was erected by the United Spanish War Veterans and the Ladies' Auxiliary. It was unveiled on Memorial Day 1914 by Thelma Moyer, the 7-year-old daughter of the organization's post commander. The memorial plaque was cast in bronze from one of the guns recovered from the battleship Maine that exploded in Havana Harbor in 1898 and led to the Spanish-American War. Beyond this stone are the graves of those who fought in two of America's most defining conflicts of the 19th century. Among their silent ranks is Lieutenant Colonel Allen Allensworth. Born a slave in Louisville, Kentucky in 1842, Allensworth served both cruel and kind masters. In violation of existing laws, he was taught to read and write. He escaped from bondage in 1863 and joined the U.S. Navy and became a captain's steward and clerk. After the war, he was ordained a Baptist minister who later served the U.S. Army as a chaplain. In his 20 years of service, he rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel, the highest rank attained by an African American up to that point. After retiring from the Army, he founded the town of Allensworth in Tulare County, California. Established as a settlement for African Americans where they could learn self-reliance and self-governance, the town is now a registered historic landmark. Allen Allensworth died in 1914 after being struck by a motorcycle in Monrovia, California. Before the Civil War, Benjamin Chambers Ludlow was a physician and the brother-in-law of Salmon P. Chase, the future Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. In 1861, he raised a troop of cavalry. The following year, he was transferred to the Army of the Potomac and became the aide-de-camp under Generals Joseph Hooker and later George Meade. Ludlow was then appointed Chief of Cavalry of the Department of Virginia and North Carolina under General Benjamin Butler. In that capacity, he was breveted Brigadier General for gallant and meritorious service. After the war, he returned to his medical practice in Cincinnati, Ohio. In 1885, he moved to California, where he spent the remainder of his life. Emmer Bowen was a private in Company C of the 127th Illinois Infantry and took part in the crucial siege of Vicksburg in 1863. In advance of an assault on the Confederate stronghold on May 22nd, General Ulysses S. Grant requested 150 volunteers for a forlorn hope, a Victorian expression for suicide mission. The volunteers, including Private Bowen, would form a storming party to go in before the main attack. Their tasks were to build a bridge across a moat and install scaling ladders against an enemy embankment. As the assault got underway, the storming party suffered terrible losses. Of the 150 volunteers, nearly half were killed. The attack was ultimately a failure, and the siege of Vicksburg would grind on for another month and a half. Emmer Bowen and the other survivors of the Forlorn Hope were all awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. After the war, he went back to work as a carpenter. He later settled in Los Angeles with his wife. During the Civil War, Private William Mays served in Company K of the 11th Iowa Infantry. In June 1864, his regiment took part in General Sherman's Atlanta campaign. Near Kennesaw Mountain on the 15th of June, Private Mays's company engaged the enemy in a fierce fight. Noticing that an injured comrade had fallen between the lines, Mays and a companion ran into heavy fire at short range and rescued the man. He served for the duration of the war and mustered out of the Army in June 1865. Afterward, he became an attorney and was later a managing director for the Los Angeles Title, Abstract, and Trust Company. On November 27, 1899, William Mays became the recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor for his act of extraordinary heroism in rescuing his wounded comrade 35 years earlier. Tristram Connell lived a long, eventful life. Born in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, he served in the infantry during the Civil War. On April 6, 1865, the Union and Confederate armies fought their last major battle at the tributary of the Appomattox River called Sailor's Creek. During the intense fighting, Tristram stormed a key Confederate position and captured their flag. For his heroism, he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. After the war, he moved west into what was then called Indian Territory. Once there, he was placed in charge of Indian affairs. In 1881, he became an express agent for Wells Fargo and personally escorted vast shipments of gold and silver through dangerous territory. He continued to work until 1925 when he retired to his home in Phoenix, Arizona, and it was there in 1937 he died at the age of 92. Tristram Connell's body was then taken to his daughter's home in Los Angeles for interment. Louis Tappan Barney enlisted as a private in the 7th New York State Militia. Though young, he was possessed with a rare talent to lead men in combat. At the age of 21, his meritorious service made him the youngest brevet brigadier general in the Union Army. He died in 1904 at the age of 60 after being struck by a runaway horse on the streets of Englewood. The newspapers said he didn't hear the warning cries because of deafness suffered during the war. In 1861, at the age of 14, Welford Bridwell enlisted as a drummer boy in the Confederate Army. He used the name Clay Buford to avoid being discharged because of his age. Eventually he served in the Virginia Infantry under General Longstreet and was wounded in the Battle of Sharpsburg. After the war, he joined the U.S. Army and fought in the Indian campaigns taking place in the Arizona Territory. It was for gallant conduct with the 5th Cavalry that he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. After leaving the Army, Buford served under Indian Agent John Clum and was Captain and Chief Scout of the San Carlos Apache Police. Buford and Clum are credited with leading the party that captured Geronimo in April 1877. Later, he became a rancher and was elected as an Arizona territorial legislator. In the 1890s, he moved to Los Angeles, where he died in 1905. After a life so richly lived, the obituary that appeared in the Herald noted simply, "The passing of a Mason." From the very beginning, Edward Lee Baker Jr.'s life seemed destined for adventure. He was born in the Wyoming Territory in a covered wagon bound for the Rocky Mountains. His father was a French fur trader and his mother a former slave. At age 16, he joined the Army as a Buffalo soldier. He served in the 10th Cavalry during the Indian Wars and was promoted to Sergeant Major, making him the highest-ranking enlisted man in the regiment. During the Spanish-American War, the 10th Cavalry was sent to Cuba. On July 1, 1898, during the Battle of Santiago, his company came under heavy enemy fire. During the fight, Baker observed one of his men tumble down an embankment into a river. Injured and weighed down by his pack, the man was unable to get out of the water. Instantly, Baker left cover to rescue the drowning man. With bullets raining down around him, Baker pulled the man from the water and carried him to safety. For his selflessness and courage, he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. After 27 years of distinguished service, Edward Lee Baker retired from the Army in 1909 at the rank of captain. His final post was with the Philippine Scouts, a distinction noted on his headstone. Baker was also the grandfather of jazz saxophonist Dexter Gordon. In 1914, this monument was unveiled at Rosedale, dedicated to the memory of a young wireless operator who was lost at sea when the oil tanker SS Rosecrans broke up in a storm. His name was Lawrence Prudence, and the tragedy of his loss is heightened by the fact that he wasn't supposed to be aboard the ship that fateful day, but he emerged as one of the story's heroes. Lawrence grew up on Venice Beach, where his father owned a cafe, and it was there that he was drawn to the sea. He was also fascinated by wireless communications pioneered by Guglielmo Marconi. He sought to combine both of his passions by serving in the U.S. Navy, but his enlistment was rejected because of a heart condition. Though disappointed, he was not to be discouraged. Using his Marconi experience, he was employed as chief wireless operator aboard a merchant steamship owned by the Associated Oil Company. In January 1913, Lawrence was set to take a few weeks off at home while his ship was held up for repairs. Before going home, he made the last-minute decision to fill in as wireless operator aboard the SS Rosecrans on its voyage to Portland, Oregon. The ship, with a crew of 36 and a cargo of 19,000 barrels of fuel oil, entered the mouth of the Columbia River early on the morning of January 7th. A powerful storm with gale-force winds of over 60 miles per hour buffeted the tanker, sending it off course until it ran aground on Peacock Spit at Cape Disappointment. As the crew made efforts to free the ship, Lawrence began broadcasting distress calls. The following message was received at 5:15 a.m.
Steamer Rosecrans on bar. Send assistance. Ship breaking up fast. Can stay at my post no longer.
Operators at the Cape Disappointment Life Station dispatched rescue boats, but they were unable to reach the doomed ship in the storm. Meanwhile, Prudence sent a final, chilling message.
Water rushing into cabins. Can't stay much longer. Help.
The rough seas made rescue attempts nearly impossible. Of the 36 men aboard the Rosecrans, 3 survived the breakup. Out of the 33 lost, only 6 bodies were recovered. The rest, including 18-year-old Lawrence Prudence, who stayed at his post till the end, were never seen again. When the design for Lawrence's memorial was finalized, it included the appropriate inscriptions, a dramatic representation of the shipwreck, and a portrait of the young hero that is now missing. Finally, they added another, more intimate detail, whose meaning is lost unless you dig into the record. In the days following the sinking, Lawrence's father sent a description of his son to the newspapers in the hope that his remains might be identified. It went as follows. Height, 5 feet 9 inches, hair blonde, eyes blue, teeth all good except one gold crown on molar, tattoo on one arm of a bathing girl, on other arm a snake encircling a sword with the words, honor, fidelity, and death. The designers borrowed from this last small detail, but instead of a sword they substituted an anchor and replaced the snake with a ribbon and a cord. But the code that Lawrence Prudence lived and died by remains forever unchanged. Of the tens of thousands buried at Rosedale, there is one name in particular that seems to turn the most heads. Her name is Maria Rasputin, the daughter of the Mad Monk of Russia. Maria was born in her father's ancestral village of Pokrovskoye in Siberia. For most of her early years, he was away on one of his many pilgrimages. In 1907, Grigory Rasputin, who had a reputation as a holy man and a healer, was called upon to cure the son of Tsar Nicholas II and the heir to the Russian imperial throne. After Rasputin prayed for young Prince Alexei, who suffered from hemophilia, his health improved. From then on, the holy man was brought into the royal family's inner circle, where he had great influence. Jealousies among the court flared, and it wasn't long before plots against Rasputin's life began to formulate. They resulted in his brutal assassination on December 17, 1916, which foreshadowed the fall of the Romanov dynasty and the rise of the Soviet era. After her father's death, Maria fled Russia with her husband and lived in exile in France. When her husband died in 1928, she became a popular cabaret dancer. She said her popularity was owed to her name and not her dancing. From there, she went on to become a circus lion tamer. When a reporter asked where she learned to tame wild animals, she replied, "It wasn't difficult after having been in a cage with Bolsheviks." Her circus performances brought her to the United States in 1935. Over the years, Maria authored several biographies about her father that debunked some of the myths about his life and death. However, many of her claims are disputed by historians. Her most controversial allegation was that Rasputin's murder was not politically motivated, but the result of having spurned the sexual advances from Prince Felix Yusupov. Maria spent her retirement years living on Social Security and income from a few odd jobs. When she died in 1977, the walls of her home were found to be covered in photographs of her father, the Mad Monk of Russia. In the world of magic, the name Houdini is synonymous with the art. But the man Houdini idolized was Harry Keller, and he is buried here at Rosedale. As a boy, Keller became obsessed with magic after witnessing the performance of a traveling street magician. Afterwards, he learned all he could from books. He apprenticed under different magicians for several years before going out on his own. While still in his 20s, he took his act overseas, traveling across 5 different continents. Keller was famous as a stage magician who set up lavish productions using props and theatrics. These surviving posters give us an idea of how mysterious and thrilling his performances must have been. With signature illusions like the levitation of Princess Karnak, self-decapitation, the nested boxes, and the vanishing lamp, he entertained audiences until his retirement in 1908. Over the years, a friendship grew between Keller and fellow magician Harry Houdini. The latter sought his advice during his efforts to expose the techniques used by fake spiritualists. In 1917, Houdini convinced his hero to come out of retirement to perform one final show. When the old magician finished his act, he ceremoniously passed the baton to his younger colleague, who in turn declared to the 6,000 people in attendance that Harry Keller was America's greatest magician. It was the Dean of Magic's last public performance. Afterward, he returned to his home in Los Angeles, where he died on March 10, 1922. The marker above his grave was dedicated in 2001 by the Academy of Magical Arts. Rosedale Cemetery is the final resting place for dozens of stars from the golden age of Hollywood. Their names might not be familiar, but many of them appeared in some of the most iconic motion pictures ever made. In Section D to the left of the main entrance is actor-musician Dooley Wilson. He began his career as a jazz drummer who made his way onto the silver screen late in life. Dooley's film career was brief, but he will forever be remembered as Sam, the piano player in the 1943 Warner Brothers classic Casablanca. Appearing with a stellar cast that included Humphrey Bogart, Ingrid Bergman, and Claude Rains, Dooley plays a central part in one of the film's most memorable scenes, where he sings as time goes by to tormented ex-lovers Rick and Ilsa. Also buried in Section D is Monroe Salsbury. He began acting on the stage before moving to films in 1914. During the silent era, he had a busy career and made several films for legendary director Cecil B. DeMille. In the early 20s, Salsbury retired to his citrus farm in Hemet, California. He made a brief comeback at the dawn of talking pictures, but his final starring role was in the 1930 serial The Jade Box. He died in virtual anonymity while at the Patton State Hospital in 1935. Here in the Pioneers Circle is the mausoleum of real estate tycoon Horace W. Chase, his wife Carrie, and their granddaughter Arlene. Arlene began her dancing career in vaudeville before joining the Ziegfeld Follies on Broadway, where she appeared in the chorus line of numerous hit shows. In the early 20s, she helped popularize a provocative new dance craze called the shimmy. The shimmy was considered scandalous at the time, and along with bootleg booze, it was singled out as a threat to American society. Besides dancing, Arlene had entrepreneurial interests as well, and for a time owned and operated a tea room. But at age 25, her life was tragically cut short by tuberculosis. During the early silent era, a new kind of villain beguiled her way onto the silver screen. These femme fatales were called vamps for the way they drained the life from anyone who became tangled in their web. Actress Louise, who was known as the Spider Woman, started playing vamp roles in 1915 when she starred in Thomas Ince's The Toast of Death. Over the next 5 years, she appeared in dozens of such films, some with such risque titles as Shackled, Love Madness, and Sex. Glom once rivaled Theda Bara as filmdom's vamp queen, and was considered the best actress playing such parts. But as the vamp craze ended, Glom was already typecast, and subsequently her film career began to dry up. By the mid-1920s, she had left Hollywood and spent the remainder of her life in retirement. Upon her death in 1970, she was laid to rest at Rosedale beside her husband of 38 years. Marshall Ambrose Neilan was one of the most respected and highest paid directors of silent films. He was one of the favorites of America's sweetheart, Mary Pickford, as he directed several of her biggest blockbusters. In 1921, Neilan went through a highly publicized divorce from his wife Gertrude Bambrick. 1 year later, he married actress Blanche Sweet, with whom he'd been having an affair. They too divorced in 1929. When Talking Pictures debuted, Neilan had difficulty working in the new medium. By then he had a reputation as an alcoholic. That, coupled with clashes with studio head Louis B. Mayer, put his career on skids. By the mid-30s, he worked piecemeal and was forced to drive a cab to support himself. His last work in Hollywood was in the role of Senator Fuller in Elia Kazan's 1957 classic, A Face in the Crowd. When Marshall Neilan died the following year, it was rumored that his old friend Mary Pickford paid for his funeral. Joseph Meyer, whose remains reside in this fine mausoleum, was president of the Myers-Zobeline Brewing Company of Los Angeles. The company produced the popular East Side beer, so called because the brewery was located on the eastern banks of the LA River. After Meyer's death in 1905, newspapers covered the construction of his elaborate mausoleum and marveled at its estimated $65,000 price tag, or roughly $2 million today. The Angelus-Rosedale Mausoleum and Columbarium is comparatively small given the size of the cemetery in which it resides. The reason is that its original purpose was as a receiving vault, or place where bodies were kept prior to burial or cremation. It was converted into its present function sometime during the early 1940s. With the conversion came the addition of the sunrise corridor, and in one of the niches you will find Asian American actor Honorable Wu. His career began on the stage where he headlined in a touring revue featuring entertainment from the Orient. Later he was a member of the Chinese Drama League before making his Hollywood debut in the 1936 Shirley Temple film Stowaway. From then until 1941, he appeared in only 7 more films, including Mr. Moto Takes a Vacation, with Peter Lorre in the titular role, and in 2 installments of the Ellery Queen series, starring Ralph Bellamy. 4 years after making his last film, Honorable Wu passed away at age 48 in Los Angeles. Also found in the Sunrise Corridor is someone who will be of interest to those who appreciate the macabre. It is writer, director, and producer Todd Browning, and if his name isn't familiar, his films will be. As a boy of 16, he ran away to join the circus, and the experience would greatly influence his art. Throughout the 20s, he made 7 films with the Man of 1,000 Faces, actor Lon Chaney. They include The Unknown, a twisted tale where Chaney plays an armless knife thrower with a secret, and the now lost vampire story, London After Midnight. Browning's dark, melodramatic output, featuring abstract plots focused on physical and psychological deformities, drew strong criticism. But the medium also gave him his greatest and most enduring success with 1931's Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi. Dracula gave him a free hand on his next project for MGM, which turned out to be a horror story set in a traveling sideshow. Freaks featured carnival denizens who unite to protect their own from a beautiful but sinister acrobat. Columnist Luella Parsons gushed that Freaks was more fantastic and grotesque than any shocker ever written. But it proved to be too much for audiences of the day. The original 90-minute cut was deemed too shocking and was shortened to just over an hour. The film was shelved and remained unseen for decades. Browning would never enjoy as much creative control again. He retired in 1939 and lived the remainder of his life in seclusion. On the way to our next visit, we passed the mausoleum of Clara Baldwin Stalker. The Baldwin Hills area of Los Angeles was named after her father, Lucky Baldwin. Clara was renowned for 3 things: her fortune, her philanthropy, and her jewels. The only thing she collected more prodigiously than husbands was expensive diamond jewelry. In fact, her spending was partly the reason her son sued her to have her declared legally incompetent so he could gain control of her estate. At the time of her death in February 1929, it was estimated that 15% of her net worth was tied up in jewels. It led to rumors that Madame Stalker went to the grave wearing her finest baubles. Any would-be grave robber should know her collection, in its entirety, was dispersed in accordance with her last will and testament. So she didn't take it with her. Not far from the Stalker Mausoleum is the resting place of Anna May Wong. She began her career at a time when Hollywood standards were governed by strict discriminatory codes. Despite that, she managed to become the first Asian American international star. Anna was cast as the lead actress in 1922's The Toll of the Sea. The film was the first to be shot entirely in Technicolor's two-strip color process. Later, she starred alongside Douglas Fairbanks in The Thief of Baghdad. The film was a huge hit and made Anna a household name. In 1926, she was on hand for the groundbreaking of Sid Grauman's Chinese Theater in Hollywood. Despite her popularity, Anna continually missed out on parts when studios cast Caucasian actresses in Asian roles. Eventually, she moved to Europe where she had the freedom to expand her talents. But by 1930, she was back in the United States. One of her last major roles was in Shanghai Express with Marlene Dietrich. Afterwards, she was relegated to playing stereotypical characters in B-movies. In 1961, she was set to return to the big screen, but her plans were cut short by her untimely death at age 56. The headstone marking her resting place bears the name of her mother in English. Anna's name and her sister Mary's are written in Chinese below. Ernest Bubbles Whitman was an actor of both stage and screen. In 1930, he appeared on Broadway with Spencer Tracy in John Wexley's prison death row drama, The Last Mile. In the 30s and 40s, he appeared in over 40 classic films. Some of his credits include John Ford's Prisoner of Shark Island, The Road to Zanzibar with Bing Crosby and Bob Hope, as well as Stormy Weather with an amazing assortment of talent from Lena Horne, Cab Calloway, and Fats Waller. In 1939, Whitman played the assistant to a vulturous carpetbagger in Gone with the Wind. After a stint on radio in The Beulah Show, Whitman made his last film appearance working again with director John Ford in The Sun Shines Bright. He passed away in Hollywood at age 61. Of all the Hollywood legends interred at Rosedale, perhaps the most notable is Hattie McDaniel. Throughout the 1930s, she appeared in numerous films, including I'm No Angel with Mae West, Judge Priest, starring humorist Will Rogers, and The Little Colonel with Shirley Temple and Lionel Barrymore.
And don't let me see you take none of them cookies. It's a good thing I didn't see you take them.
In 1935, she played Jean Harlow's maid in China Seas. The film also starred Clark Gable. Hattie would work with Gable again 4 years later in the Civil War epic Gone with the Wind. The film was a smash hit and has gone down in history as one of the greatest ever made. Gone with the Wind went on to win 8 competitive Oscars, the most ever won for a film up to that point. Hattie McDaniel in the role of Mammy made history by winning the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress, becoming the first African American to take home an Oscar. Throughout Hattie's career, she was mainly cast as a domestic servant, which drew criticism from some in the black community. They felt it added to black oppression by perpetuating negative stereotypes. But the characters Hattie played were always greater than their station in life. She gave them wisdom, determination, and self-pride, proving that no one was her better. When Hattie left us at the young age of 57, it was her wish to be interred at Hollywood Cemetery. However, the owners at the time did not allow African Americans to be buried there, so she was laid to rest at her second choice, Rosedale. If you're ever called upon to name a true legend, you need only give one name: Hattie McDaniel. The Victorians had a term for expansive cemeteries like Angelus-Rosedale. They called them quiet cities. It is a quaint and even poetic expression, but one that I feel is not entirely accurate, because for all their stillness, they are anything but quiet. For these are not just places to keep the dead, they are storehouses of memory. And within, the memories flow and intersect with an almost harmonic quality, like that of an invisible chorus. And if you allow them, they will guide you toward discoveries you never expected. The stories I have shared with you over the last hour are only a tiny fraction of what can be told. But it's my hope that they have given you a clearer picture of what can be found here or in any cemetery anywhere in the world. Additionally, I hope that you will come away with a sense that there are no small lives and that no one is ever truly forgotten, especially if you take the time to walk in places like these and listen to the chorus of the ages. Thank you for watching. If you liked what you saw, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. It really helps a lot. And if you enjoy these videos and are interested in becoming a sponsor, click the link in the description below to go to my Patreon page. Even $1 per month goes a long way to bringing you more of these stories. And if you haven't already, please subscribe now for more grave explorations.